Okay.
Okay. Today is August 9th, 2021.
And so we'll see. This recording may or may not work because of my speaker issue, but I think it should be fine. So
Okay.
if not, we'll review for people briefly next week. Let's see. So where were we?
We were talking about recruitment and rhythmicity and perception in relation to the different subpopulations in the cortex. We talked about the difference between seizure, sleep, and arousal in terms of the hypersynchrony in seizure, the desynchrony in arousal, and the intermediate stage in sleep, which is moderate synchrony. And I mentioned the work by Donald B. Lindsley, who explained the change in shape of the EEG, where the arousal is characterized as slow, low amplitude fast waves, whereas sleep is high amplitude slow waves, and seizures are abnormally high amplitude and very slow because it's just paroxysms of synchrony. And his idea was that their perceptual and response optimal moments in terms of the activity of neuronal populations, where and the activity of the neuron populations is reflected in the EEG. So that it's the algebraic sum of all the graded action and graded potentials. So the idea is that in hypersynchrony, like in a seizure, ultra large populations of neurons are all firing in synchrony, and then they're quiet. And that is abnormal because then there are long periods of lack of responsiveness and lack of movement. And the movements, when they occur, are all spastic. They're uncontrolled and just gross movements. And so the idea, I mean, his data were that he showed that during the alpha wave, there was an optimal speed of reaction time to a strobe light. A single strobe flash was presented at various times and correlated with when along the alpha wave those strobe lights occurred. And the instruction to the people was press the button as soon as you see the flash. And what he showed was that at a certain phase, at the peak of the alpha, was when, or a little bit after, just after the peak of an alpha wave, that was the moment of fastest reaction time. So there could be many alpha waves.
Did you say after the peak?
Well, it's just from the peak and a little bit after, a few degrees, the peak and a little bit after. That was, if I remember his diagram, his summary diagram accurately, it was right. I mean, but the point is that there's a small window during the alpha phase when reaction time is fastest.
Okay, but this is like fascinating in that, like, well, for many reasons, but one is like my intuition would be telling me like it would be a little bit before, and then like the peak would be like the closing off of the window, and so that you're actually getting the information in slightly after the window, that there is that thickness. I don't know quite what to make of that, but that's really
I'll have to check on the original paper, as to exactly where the reaction time was fastest. But so that was, so what his idea was that there are populations of neurons that gate response to sensory input and the motor response to that sensory input. That it's not uniform in time. It's not it's not equally distributed in time. So if that occurs in the alpha wave, that there's an optimal moment, and that corresponds to subsequent studies where people showed that the threshold to see a strobe flash when they adjusted the intensity was also corresponded to specific phase of the alpha wave, and also that when a uniform intensity of light was flashed, there was a greater evoked visual response in the visual cortex at the peak of alpha than to other phases of the alpha. So all those lines of evidence indicate that the phase of the EEG is representing a change in sensitivity of a subpopulation of neurons. And what Lindsley then extrapolated to the EEG, that arousal is a low amplitude fast waves. What that really means is that you have a lot of subpopulations of neurons who showing activity peaks at different phases in relation to each other. So they're all showing this rhythmical activity, but out of phase. So when you have two big electrodes on two, measuring the entire field of all these subpopulations, they're all doing their thing out of phase with each other. And that means that when you added up the activity algebraically, it looks like it's fast activity, but it looks like low amplitude fast activity, as opposed to if they all get in phase, then it looks like it's slow activity and high amplitude. Do you follow that reasoning? So that's how he explained the change in EEG pattern, where it's not really fast waves. The subpopulations are going at their regular rate, at their optimal rates. But the point that the fact that they're out of phase with each other makes it look like the algebraic sum is a much faster wave, a much faster EEG pattern. But it's not really faster. It's just they're all out of phase with each other. So it looks like very bumpy.
So if I'm understanding, there's maybe it's like something related to like the time constants for like neuron level integration, or maybe like bottlenecked by like the ability of like local ensembles to coordinate to get there, to make sure that the messages are coming in within the window where the action potentials can keep going.
So
but
the idea,
that's not changing.
So during arousal, there's a differentiation of all these different subpopulations, so that they're all out of phase with each other. But that means that at any moment, some subpopulation is responsive to input and to output optimally. You have an opportunity in time for optimal responsiveness and sensitivity and response at some from some subpopulation, as opposed to during sleep, which is like an intermediate stage where it's there's a lot of synchrony among the subpopulations. So it looks like they're going, there's much slower activity and much higher intensity.
So-
But there's less moments of optimal responsivity.
So, so a few things. Okay, so we're having like this hierarchy of scales of sensitivity for neuronal populations, moving up from uh, slower seeming because there's more populations in sync. And
Right.
so they're establishing these like synchronization manifolds, these coordination regimes. Uh, you're getting big signals evolving slowly. But then as you move to something like uh, you know,
But his
alpha
point,
and
wait.
beta,
Let me
they're actually,
stop
they're
you. Let me
yeah,
stop you for a moment,
yeah.
because the actual activity of any subpopulation is about the same, regardless of whether it's during arousal or during sleep. Their individual intensity of activity it remains more or less constant. It's just that the appearance of the amplitude and speed of and frequency of the EEG just appears to change because of the amount of differentiation into different phase relationships.
But the neurons themselves and the local
the
populations are
the
still
subpopulations
operating
at the
within
same
like
within their range. They don't so it's really a
that
question
makes some
of,
sense because like
it
neurons,
does
you'd
make
expect
sense.
them to be pushed like pretty close to like optimality criteria for signaling. And like they're not going to be able to probably like, while there could be like some mode shifts with things like neuromodulation, you're not going to be moving too far from this like optimal ability to generate action
That's right.
potentials and reset.
They stay in their optimal range of
That makes
sensitivity
sense.
and responsiveness, and it's just a question of how many subpopulations are out of. I mean, how many different subpopulations are there at any moment? And during arousal, there are many more of these all these subpopulations. Let's say it's the same number of subpopulations. Say it's 100 subpopulations. If they're all firing at the same time, you have a slow wave, a large amplitude slow wave. If they're all out of phase with each other, then it looks like it's a low amplitude fast wave. When you look at the overall EEG, because you're taking the activity of the entire population. So it's just a question of a shift in the synchrony among all these subpopulations.
So would this be consistent? With what you're saying, I've been thinking. I think I got this from Butsaki initially, but this idea of a kind of inverse hierarchy of the ability of synchronous complexes to form and the rate at which you could detect oscillations. So something like you could have like a smaller population, like maybe locally, like for instance, like a couple neurons all nearby each other achieving synchrony at gamma. Now they'll all be in the way you're describing, like because it's locally determined, they'll be out of sync relative to each other probably under a lot of circumstances. And so it'll be overall very low amplitude. But is there any evidence that that you've seen that there's this like this inverse hierarchy where the larger the scope of the synchronization, it's also spatially larger, but the neurons themselves and their rates, they're not changing, but the ability to coordinate has this inverse
That's
relationship.
exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly the point. Yeah.
So and good. So okay, I'm getting it.
So the difference between the appearance of theta and alpha and gamma is really reflecting the degree of synchrony in different systems, in different neural systems that are doing they're performing different things like in the rat during exploratory sniffing behavior. That's theta. So that's the, you know, the hippocampal and whatever, the whole hippocampal system and interactions. During alpha, it's a different set of optimal function, different functions.
And so
Because
like you're establishing like, and from what you're saying, like alpha is actually well tuned to be there for attentional selection. So the strobe is coming in, and that strobe, when it's at the up state or near the peak of alpha, you register it. And so
Right.
alpha seems to be well poised to be at this sort of level where you can basically attend to something with perception and be aware of it.
Visual.
Yeah, visual. So
At least, I mean, at least visual, maybe, I mean, but it's not only visual, it's also the reaction time, you know, so it's the visual information telling the motor system to react.
so and this is linking it to action too. So this is not just it's not just registering visual, but this is also visual. Also it's the perception occurring in a way that it can be linked to action.
It can be linked to action, yeah.
But the question though, am I correct that the actions though themselves, they tend to evolve slower at theta frequencies? Like that is the act, like.
No, I don't think you should, I don't think you should attribute, I don't think you should attribute only motor to theta, because no, because
every alpha window can be linked to the motor system. Every alpha window.
Wait, during theta, there's also it's paying attention to olfactory and tactile input. So it's different systems optimally tuned. I mean, in other words, the throughput from the visual system to, say, the finger system, the finger motor system, is optimal at the peak of alpha. So that means that whatever the subpopulation is that generates the alpha wave, whatever that subpopulation is, it is it's the throughput from the visual system to the motor, at least the hand system, the finger system, the motor finger is optimal at the peak of the alpha. So when the neurons that generate the alpha are optimally active, it's not only optimal sensitivity to light, which it is, the threshold is lowest to incoming light, but also the throughput of the visual input out to the finger motor is also optimal. Lowest
so this is important for me to update on. So alpha, at every point, you're getting this sort of I don't know, mesoscale, but optimal coupling of perception and action. But and it's not that you have to wait for theta to get to action, but it's actually a broader, richer zone of integration on the level of perception and action. So maybe like more, if you want to say intentional or something like this, more complicated integration on perception action would be involving more things being brought together, more multimodal, more complexly determined action. But like alpha, at every point is this opportunity for optimal coupling between perception and action, and maybe involving like faster, well, it would be faster, but like almost more like reflex arc like, but like higher level.
Yeah.
So you're establishing a reflex arc.
But it's not at all moment.
Connectivity
it's only at an optimal phase.
At peak alpha.
Peak. Yeah.
So
okay, so and now theta, it's the same principle with theta, but it's paying attention to different stimuli. It's utilizing the activity in a different system, a different set of requirements for the organism, for the brain, a different set of sensory input and motor output. So that's what I mean. It represents the activity in different systems. And the gamma is probably enables, it's like a super arousal, because then you have many more subpopulations all out of phase with each other and all able to respond differentially, but maybe within a certain, maybe there's an underlying alpha and theta process going on, but it's just that the gamma is giving more, enabling more subsystems in the brain to all get their information in for a particular response.
But there's a kind of cross-frequency coupling at play, such
There
that
is.
even though they're out of sync, when you're trying to bring things, so in a way, this is reminding me of like Singer and like early work by like Christoph and Koch, where they were just talking about the gamma. But what you're talking about is basically a hierarchy of binding of increasingly complex things. So like when you're getting to, so even though they're out of sync, you have these opportunities for richer and richer binding as you're moving from gamma,
I think,
beta to alpha.
Okay, here's my working hypothesis with no evidence. But my hypothesis is that whatever systems are involved in generating alpha, or generating theta, whatever neural system is involved in generating theta,
Hippocampal, entorhinal, probably especially.
whatever. Okay.
Yeah.
Whatever system is involved in generating alpha, with thalamocortical, okay, plus whatever system is involved in generating gamma, that all those systems, and whatever they do, whatever they're specialized to do when it's in pure form, you know, if it's pure alpha, pure theta, or pure gamma, you know, something, there are these more pure states, certainly, okay? But I would say my working hypothesis is that all those systems are working simultaneously. We just can't, there's our measurements can't differentiate it, but I would bet that they're all going at the same time. So that the gamma, if the gamma is going at say 40 per second, and the alpha is or say the gamma is going at 40 per second, the theta is going at 4 per second, say. That's the low frequency. Let's say it's 40 and 4. That means that there could be 10 different subsystems in the gamma system, feeding information into the
Alpha.
theta system, into the
Via
theta
alpha?
system. Well, then it could be if
Like,
alpha,
are they packaged via like an alpha envelope, or
no, wait, if it's feed the gamma at 40 per second feeding into the alpha at say 10 per second is giving 4 inputs per alpha wave. Four different systems can be providing information to the alpha system because the gamma is going 10 times as fast, and it's going for going from 40 to 4. Well, no, that's 10 times. Wait, for going, it's 4. The gamma is going 4 times as fast as the alpha, and it's going 10 times as fast as the theta. So it can be providing 4 bits of information, 4 different system inputs to the alpha at each moment, or at each, say, given the same chunk of time. It can be giving 4 different system inputs to alpha and 10 different system inputs into theta, into whatever the theta system is doing and whatever the alpha system. So the gamma can be feeding in much faster information, or information gathered at much smaller intervals in time.
Yet made coherent via this hierarchy of scales of integration where the up states are being achieved over different scales, providing, even though the gamma will be out of sync, it can then come into a different synchronization.
It can provide
Rhythm.
input. It can
Mhm.
provide input into the alpha and the theta systems.
So in addition to like, so it seems like we might have like both centralized sources that are acting in a slightly like they're tuned to be pacemakers, but you're also getting, from what I'm gathering from what you're saying, a kind of distributed emergent, it's all emergent, but this one like more distributed, more emergent sources of these oscillations, and they could potentially couple or influence each other. So like the idea would be like, okay, you might have like,
Yeah.
like hippocampal entorhinal itself just being well tuned to respond to theta, to generate theta. But also from what you're describing, there could be another source of theta that's just coming from the way that like the brain as a whole is tuned in terms of getting these like uh emergent sources of rhythms as you're as like the 40 hertz being the like for instance, like alpha being emergent if these 40 hertz oscillations are being put into like theta envelopes, something like this, you're going to get like an alpha beat or something like that, potentially. Like there, I don't know if that quite works, but the
I don't know what you mean by beat. I think it's the
beat might not be the right word.
input and output. You know, the throughput from input to output. If you think of it in terms of throughput, that these theta, alpha, and gamma are really representing neural subgroups that are that have at the peak of their activity, they have the highest likelihood of generating an output. Or if they could be their sensitivity could be increasing. The more I mean, it's really the more synchronized they are, which is generating up to the peak. The more synchronized they are, if you they're always responsive. But if the more synchronized they are, if there's an input that comes in at the peak, that means that they're all ready to fire out. They're all ready to give an output at the peak. So they can respond to input at any time. But the fact that you have a subpopulation all becoming more and more synchronized in their sensitivity to input, which is true because that's when, at the peak of the alpha, you get the highest evoked potential. So that means that those units are all sensitive, but when they're all firing together, the response, the sum of their response is greatest. And so what's the purpose of the sum of the response? The sum of the response is an output. So that's when they can generate an output to a different system, so to someplace else.
Bringing together enough forms of information that you have like more reliable inferences, more or just like richer combinations of sense data, but also the output being both like, okay, this is what we think is happening, but also this is what we think at some level we ought to do. And this could be like either at the level of a reflex arc, something like alpha, or it could be at the level of or maybe the refresh rate of consciousness, or it could be a theta, a more like the animal moving to a place or whisking or like sniffing in a direction.
Not only that, but not only moving, but computing what is the meaning of the olfactory input in conjunction with what is the meaning of the tactile input.
Uh-huh.
And
so
so,
there's both like,
so what? Is it going to elicit chewing because it identifies a piece of food from the odor and the touch, or is it going to elicit if it doesn't switch over into eating because it's not the correct input, then it just continues exploring. So
So
the olfactory input makes the difference between a rock and a piece of food. So the olfactory input switches over to the chewing output.
and so the slower the zone of integration, the more things that can enter the mix, and
Exactly.
the more informed the decision can make. So let's say like
exactly, that's right.
the smell, you're trying to determine like what ought I to do given, or how ought I to feel or think or whatever given what I'm smelling. You're going to want to get in enough causes, enough forms of information that you can create a meaningful organismic response.
That's
And
right.
so you're going to want to, and so there would be certain things like,
And it may be
yeah.
what you're saying. It may be that the olfactory system has so many different olfactory sensors that there are so many different possible odors that it takes a long time to figure out relatively long time to figure out what is the meaning of this particular odor, as opposed to all the other million, or the million other odors, all the other million odor sensors in the olfactory bulb. So maybe it's more complicated to make a decision about an olfactory input than it is to make an input about a visual system, or maybe there can all be all kinds of speculations that then maybe the gamma is only the information provider. It's only saying, this is responding to this, and this, and you do,
Just the observations, just the facts.
Here's the report. Now you integrate it and make some decision based on it.
Just give me all the details. Don't try to get fancy at gamma.
That's right.
We'll get fancy later.
Yeah, the gamma is not involved in directly in the motor system, in a motor response. That you need other systems to do that. It's telling you what it sees. It's a photograph of the environment. It's all the pixels of the environment, of the picture of the environment.
So with Theta, you were describing this. So I was initially thinking in terms of like the affordance of the animal and like the actions, rather like what would be required for a coherent evolution of action perception cycles that would make sense given the meaning of something like olfaction. But you're also saying there's a constraint from potentially the sensory discrimination task itself.
Yeah.
That, like, for instance, like the rate of diffusion of odorants could cause them to get mixed together, that it's just a challenging problem that you need a little bit more time to come to a meaningful decision.
Exactly.
And so it's not that there's like one like true story here, but it's these multiple intersecting constraints that are playing off each other of what the like negotiated optimal type of rhythm for integration might be. It's like going to be, so there will be like a constraint of like when like olfactory related sources of theta, there will be some constraint of what it takes to coherently smell. But there's also going to be constraints of what you want to do with the information. And there also is going to be constraints of what systems need to be involved. And these are all sort of mutually determining the optimum, which you're going to be tuned to. Is that okay?
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. Yeah.
And so you got to go soon, right?
Yeah, in a few minutes.
So for a couple of things before I forget. So one, I want to talk about so we have so much to cover. So one thing I want to talk about is why I was slightly surprised at if the timing of the window of sensitivity is slightly after. And the other thing I want to do is like discuss basically the connection to orgasm as a kind of quasi-epileptiform process and what this also might tell us about consciousness. But so I guess to kind of go to like in the weeds a bit, because for instance, you're talking about like this, because I think it was 2013 or 2011 was your paper where you first like put that idea out there, that like orgasm is a kind of a mostly benign quasi seizure. Like,
yeah, but maybe yeah, but maybe it's the that's what gives it the intensity of perception, the perceptual intensity. But I mean, I think that's a conversation for next week.
Oh yeah, so I want to move there with
Okay,
you
let's
eventually.
okay, bring that.
Yeah,
Let's
because there's things also I
think
want to
about
connect to,
that.
like for instance, like I'm wondering, I'm going to talk later about like uh the apparently reliable signal of like 10 hertz rectal contractions. And for instance, that's like right around alpha. And so I'm wondering, is there like a feedback loop? Like, is that an interesting signature based on what we're talking about in terms of that perceptual intensity? Is part of it that like the smooth muscle, these burst modes of the generators?
I think
Is
there's
there
also
like, yeah,
I think there's also an 8 per second contraction of the during ejaculation, if I remember correctly. I think there's 8 per second, isn't it? From the Kinsey, from Masters and Johnson. I think they measured contraction of maybe bulbar cavernosus muscle.
okay, so that's
I
really
think eight.
fascinating.
I think 8 per second,
So very low alpha
or high theta,
or high
or
theta.
both.
So
Or
that's
maybe
really
that's
interesting.
a maybe the point of convergence between low alpha and high theta has significance, because that's where that's an optimal communication between the two different systems at 8 per second.
Mm. Okay, so that's important
Because
to
the
me.
theta can definitely go up to 9. I've
So
measured that in rats. It can
I was
definitely
just
go, it goes
I
up
was
to
just
9.
I was just treating like these like zones where it's like there as something that's just confusing to me. And I was wondering if
No,
that's actually confusing to the brain too. But you're
no,
actually
no.
saying this
Maybe
might be
that's
an
getting.
optimal coupling point.
It's like a transmission in a car, for Christ's sake. It's. I mean, getting two different.
Okay.
When you shift gears, you have to get the two different speeds. Gear speeds have to be synchronized to make the shift. You have to get the gears going. They both have to be on in order to go from one to the other.
You're ready to go from one to the other.
So maybe that's what happens at orgasm. When what happens when there's convergence between the alpha and the theta rates. There must be something unique going on in the brain. Something new is facilitated, because it's like it's the point where you can make the shift between say first and second gear.
I'm viewing this as like a royal road into basically understanding what aspects of neural syntax and biophysics really related very much to the hard problem, and that like
Yeah,
if orgasm is this like peak perceptual vividness, and then there's like these signatures of coordination along different rhythms, I think this is probably going to be a hugely valuable source of information about like the actual biophysical processes that allow for perceptual synthesis, because we know that one of the most intensely vivid percepts that people have access to, we know this, is a climax.
yeah.
And so
So maybe
what is
that's
it?
where
Yeah.
the two systems, those two systems are linked.
So
They're they're
no,
they're they're firing in unison at 8 per second, and that's where the bulbar cavernosus contractions are generating proprioceptive input. I
but I'm
mean,
wondering if it's like this, like basically through like you're both generating it, but you mentioned like if the signal comes in phase with the upstate, you also register it more, and
that's
it
right.
generates a stronger evoked potential. So you're
Exactly.
getting like, so the positive feedback, like, so
That's
you
right.
came at this, we came to this kind of interesting. Like I had like a kind of cheat sheet that like my, uh, we'll get into this later, but but you get this positive feedback loop between entrainment and attention, where the more you can so when the rhythms are in phase, it's like I'm wondering if like it's the most intense one if like you're generating right at around alpha these or high theta, these pulses of coordinated sensation coming in, but those are the very things that are driving the effectors too.
Exactly. It's the optimal
Boom.
input output. Yeah.
So the one,
Whatever.
okay,
Yeah.
okay, I want to let you get to your next meeting,
I
but one
really
quick.
have no, I really have to go.
So the quick
So
thing about alpha, so Well, later we'll talk about synchronizing metronomes and about windows of influencing what the rhythm is that they negotiate with
Yeah.
relation to things. But we'll get into this later.
That was a beautiful demonstration of those metronomes. I mean, the formal term is a loosely coupled oscillator.
Loosely coupled oscillator.
That's the formal scientific term in rhythm or frequency analysis. Is loosely coupled oscillators. Those metronomes all going at different rates. They're loosely coupled. They're not directly physically connected. They're indirectly connected by the platform, and they get themselves into synchrony.
So next week I want to spend a little bit of time at least discussing loosely coupled oscillators
and zones
of integration windows.
Okay, loosely coupled oscillators is what gives the appearance in the EEG of arousal.
So I'm going to want to poke at that and get a little bit more into the.
And then when they get synchronized, that gives the appearance of theta or alpha. That's the idea of the loosely coupled oscillators. The subsystems in the brain they're all firing like the metronomes. They all have their rhythm, but they can become coupled under certain circumstances. And that's what we see. When the rat is paying attention, when it has to make a decision of whether to jump off the table or not, that's when you see the strongest theta. So there's something going on, anyway, to be continued next week. Really, I really have to go. It's a hard stop.
Looking forward to next week.
Me too. Okay, thanks. Take care, Adam.
You too.